My name is Sarah, and I had spent 15 years in a house where my voice was never heard. And I would wake up every morning when the sky was still dark and the stars had not yet gone away. My bare feet would touch the cold kitchen floor, and I would walk to the stove. I would turn on the burner. I would knead the dough. I would make breakfast for everyone. I would brew the coffee. For all of them. Every morning. Every single day. Without anyone ever asking, Sarah, did you eat today? Without anyone ever asking, Sarah, are you okay? And this was my home. The home I had come into as a young bride. And in this home, the only job a woman had was to keep everyone comfortable and stay quiet about her own heart. And my mother-in-law was named Barbara. She was the kind of woman who had a sharp edge hidden in every sentence she said. She would eat the food I made and say it is a little bland today. She would drink the coffee I brewed and say it is too weak. She would look at the kitchen I had just cleaned and find the one corner I had missed. And she would point to it without a word and just look at me. And I would look down. And I always looked down. And my husband was named Daniel. He was a good man. I still believe that today. But being a good man and being a good husband are two very different things. Daniel never raised his voice at me. He never said anything cruel. But when his mother said Sarah did this wrong, he would go quiet. And when his mother said Sarah is not doing enough, he would look away from me. And that silence was the thing that hurt the most. And not the words. And the silence. And we had a daughter together. Her name was Lily. She was 7 years old when everything in my life started to shift. She loved me with her whole heart. She would crawl into bed next to me at night and wrap her small arms around me and say, "Mommy, you are the best mommy in the whole world." And I would think that if even one person in this world is on my side, then I can keep going. And there was one thing in that house that belonged only to me. An old journal with a blue cover. Every night after everyone had gone to sleep, I would sit in the corner of the kitchen with my journal and write. I would write about the things that hurt. I would write about the small things that made me feel okay. The way Lily laughed when something surprised her. The way a bird came and sat on my windowsill some mornings. The way rain sounded on the roof when I stood still long enough to actually listen to it. And that journal was my voice when I had no other voice. And then one day something happened that changed the direction of my life. And Lily came home from school with red eyes. She told me her teacher had announced that there would be a parent-teacher conference and that a parent needed to come. Lily looked at me and said, "Mommy, you are going to come, right?" And I said, "Yes, baby, I will be there." But when I told Daniel, he said his mother had mentioned that I should not go out alone. He said someone else would go. Him or his brother. And I asked why. And he said his mother just did not feel comfortable with it. And I stood there in the kitchen trying to understand what exactly his mother was not comfortable with. What was wrong with a mother going to her daughter's school? What was the problem with sitting across from a teacher and hearing about your own child? But I said nothing. And I swallowed it like I swallowed everything. And that night I opened my journal and wrote. I wrote that I am exhausted. I wrote that I feel like a tree that nobody waters, but that somehow keeps standing because its roots are buried so deep that they find their own water in the dark. And the conference happened without me. Daniel went. He came back and said the teacher told him Lily is very bright. And I smiled. And inside I cried. Because that moment was mine and I had been kept from it. And then a few weeks later a new family moved into the house next door. The woman's name was Michelle. She had moved from another state with her husband who had just started a new job in the city. Michelle was warm in the way that some people are warm without even trying. She knocked on my door one afternoon and introduced herself and said she was just trying to meet the neighbors. And Barbara answered the door and invited her in. There was coffee. There was small talk. But after Michelle left, Barbara said to me that I should not get too close to her. She said we do not know what kind of person she is. She said new people cannot be trusted so quickly. And I nodded silently like I always did. But Michelle did not let the distance stay between us. And every morning after the men left for work, she would call out to me from the yard. She would say, "Sarah, come sit with me for a little while." At first I hesitated. At first I made excuses. But slowly I started going. And sitting in Michelle's kitchen I realized something I had almost forgotten. And I could breathe there. And Michelle asked me questions that nobody had asked me in years. She asked me what I liked to read. She asked me what I was good at. She asked me what I had always wanted to do with my life. And every time she asked, I would feel a strange jolt go through me. And because it had been so long since anyone had asked me about me. And I told Michelle that I had gone to college for 2 years before my marriage. I told her I had always loved writing. I told her I kept a journal. She leaned forward when I said that, and she said, "Sarah, why don't you go back to school?" And I said, "How would I do that?" And she said, "There are online programs. You can study from home. You can do it around your schedule." And I said I would never get permission. And she said, "You have to at least ask." And that night I lay awake for a very long time thinking. I opened my journal and wrote. I wrote the question, do I have the right to want something for myself? And the next morning I waited until Barbara had gone to her room, and then I sat down with Daniel at the kitchen table. And I told him I wanted to go back to school. Online. From home. I told him the housework would not be affected. I told him I would manage everything. And Daniel said he would have to talk to his mother. And I said okay. And then I did something I had never done before. I did not wait in the other room. I sat at the table and waited. And when Barbara came out, I looked at her and I told her myself. Calmly. Without my voice shaking even though my hands were. And Barbara said, "What is the point of going back to school now?" She said, "There is plenty of work here to keep you busy." And I said the work will still get done. But I want to study. And she said she was not going to spend money on something like this. And I said I will pay for it myself. I have been saving small amounts for years. And after that sentence the room went very quiet. And Barbara looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at me. And for the first time something shifted in him. He told his mother that if Sarah wanted to study and was willing to pay for it herself, then he was not going to stop her. And I held still on the outside. And on the inside I felt something crack open. Like a window that had been painted shut for 15 years suddenly came loose. And I enrolled in an online program the following week. Michelle helped me fill out the forms. She sat next to me at her kitchen table while we worked through the application together. And the day my course materials arrived, I held the books against my chest the way you hold something you thought you had lost forever. And Lily saw me and said, "Mommy, you are going to school too." And I said, "Yes, baby." And she said, "Then we can study together." And from that evening on we sat across from each other at the kitchen table. She with her homework and me with my textbooks. She would ask me for help with her math and I would help her. I would ask her to quiz me on vocabulary, and she would quiz me with the most serious face a 7-year-old can make. And for the first time in a long time I felt like I was something. And not just the person who cooked and cleaned and stayed quiet. And something more. And Barbara did not make it easy. She found reasons to comment. She said the laundry was not done on time because of my studying. She said the floor was not swept because I was busy with my books. She said Daniel came home tired and I was sitting at the table reading instead of waiting for him at the door. And I listened. But I did not break. And because I knew that at the end of every day there were 2 hours that belonged to me. And in those 2 hours I was not just Daniel's wife or Barbara's daughter-in-law or even Lily's mother. I was Sarah. And Sarah had thoughts and ambitions and a mind that worked. And months passed and I took my first exam. And I passed. And when I found out I called Michelle and she screamed into the phone so loud that Lily came running into the kitchen to see what happened. Michelle came over that afternoon with a small cake and candles and she said, "Sarah, this is a celebration." And I cried. And because nobody in that house had ever celebrated something I did. And Daniel found out that evening. He said that is good. And just those 3 words. But those 3 words from him were more than I had expected, and I held on to them. And the following semester I kept going. I kept studying. And I also started something else. And Michelle told me that some women in the neighborhood were doing small sewing and alterations work from home. A local tailor shop was sending work out to people and paying them per piece. Michelle thought I should try it since I had always been good with my hands. And I asked Daniel if I could do work from home. And he said as long as everything in the house was still getting done, he had no objection. And I started. And the first month I made $40. And those $40 were the most meaningful $40 of my entire life. I did not spend them. I put them in the back of my journal. That night before I went to sleep, I took them out and held them in my hand in the dark. And Lily woke up and saw me sitting up, and she asked, "Mommy, what are you holding?" And I said, "Something I earned, baby." And she said, "Can I see?" And I put the bills in her little palm and said, "Your mommy made this herself." And her eyes went wide and she said, "Mommy, you are so strong." And I turned off the light and lay down next to her and stared at the ceiling with a feeling in my chest that I did not have a word for. And something like pride. And something like quiet joy. And something like I exist and I matter and I did this. And over the next several months, my sewing work grew. The shop started sending me more pieces. My savings grew. I paid for my next semester myself without hesitation. I started buying small things for Lily with my own money. A book she wanted. A pair of shoes for school. And Barbara noticed. And at first she said less because she could see I was no longer shaking when she said something. Then she noticed that I was contributing to the household in small ways too. Covering small expenses here and there. Buying groceries without being asked. And her sharpness got quieter. And not gone, but quieter. And I understood something about this world then. And when a woman has something of her own, people begin to treat her differently. It should not be that way. But it is that way. And knowing that is not defeat. Knowing that is just understanding the terrain you are walking on so you can walk more carefully. And then came a day I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. And Lily's school held a spring assembly. The students were presenting their work and giving short talks in front of the parents. Lily had been chosen to speak. She had been practicing at home every evening for 2 weeks. She had made me listen to her every single night. And the school sent a note home asking parents to attend. And I showed Daniel the note and I said, "I am going." And he said, "Okay." And Barbara said nothing. And I went to Michelle's house that morning and she helped me pick out what to wear. I wore a pale blue dress and she lent me a white cardigan and she said, "Sarah, you look lovely." And I said, "I feel a little nervous." And she laughed and said, "You're going to see your daughter speak. You are allowed to be nervous." And we walked to the school together. And when Lily saw me come through the door of the gymnasium, her whole face changed. She ran across the room and grabbed my hand and said, "Mommy, you came, you really came." And I said, "Of course I came, baby." And she held my hand until the ceremony started. And when it was her turn to speak, she stood up at the front of the room with her paper in her hands, and she looked right at me before she began. And then she said she wanted to talk about her hero. She said her hero was her mother. She said her mother went back to school even when it was hard. She said her mother made things with her hands and earned her own money. She said her mother taught her that when life is difficult, you do not give up, you just find a different way to keep going. And I was sitting in a folding chair in the second row, and I could not stop the tears. And the woman sitting next to me touched my arm gently and asked if I was all right. And I said yes. I am just very happy. And she smiled and said, "Your daughter is wonderful." And I said, "I know." And on the walk home, Michelle and I did not talk much. We just walked side by side in the late afternoon light. And she said, "What are you thinking about?" And I said, "I am thinking about the journal I kept when everything felt impossible. I wrote in it that I was a tree nobody watered. But today, I think I have been watering myself this whole time, and I just did not realize it." And Michelle was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard anyone say." And when I got home, Barbara was in the living room. She looked up and asked how it went. And I told her Lily gave a talk in front of everyone and the whole room listened. And Barbara was quiet for a moment and then said she must have gotten her confidence from somewhere. And it was the closest thing to a compliment she had ever given me. And I went to the kitchen and stood at the window and looked out at the backyard where Lily's swing set was standing in the golden late afternoon light. And I thought about the woman I was 15 years ago when I first came to this house. Young and quiet and so full of a life she had not yet lived. So ready to be loved and so unsure of how to ask for it. And I thought about all the mornings I stood at that same stove and felt invisible. And I thought about now. And I was not a different person. And I was the same person who had always been there. I just had not been allowed to take up space. And slowly, I had learned how to take up space anyway. Not loudly. Not with fights and arguments and doors slamming, but quietly and steadily like water that finds its way through stone not by force, but by consistency. And that night I opened my green journal. I had filled the blue one long ago and bought a new one. On the first page of the green journal, I had written a list the day I bought it. A list of things I wanted in the next 5 years. And I wanted to finish my degree. And I wanted to grow my sewing work into something real. And I wanted Lily to know that the world was open to her and that no door was too heavy for her hands. And I wanted to say to myself every single day, Sarah, you are enough. You have always been enough. And I looked at that list that night and I thought about how far I had already come toward it. And Michelle is still my closest friend. She moved back to her home state last year because her husband was transferred again. But we talk every week. She calls me on Sunday mornings, and we talk for an hour about everything and nothing. She always ends the call by saying, Sarah, I am so proud of you. And I always say, Michelle, you were the window I looked through when I had forgotten there was a sky. And Lily is 11 now. She wants to be a doctor. She is the most serious and the most funny person I know, and I do not know how both of those things live inside one small human being, but they do. Every evening she still sits across from me at the kitchen table while I study and she studies. She still asks me for help. And I still ask her to quiz me. And Daniel and I have learned how to talk to each other better than we used to. We are not perfect. Our marriage has scars. But we are both trying. He told me a few months ago that watching me go back to school and build something for myself made him understand things about me that he had missed before. He said, I am sorry I did not see it sooner. And I said I am sorry too. Because I should have spoken sooner. But some things take the time they take. And Barbara still lives with us. She is older now and quieter. We are not close in the way I once hoped we would be. But we are peaceful. And peace is something I used to not know how to value. Now I know that peace is everything. And my story is not a dramatic one. And no one is going to make a movie about it. And there were no grand gestures. No single moment where everything turned around and became perfect. There was just one small decision after another. Getting up one more morning. Picking up a pencil one more time. Asking for one thing more than I thought I was allowed to ask for. And each small decision added to the one before it until one day I looked around and realized the life I was standing in was different from the one I had been surviving in before. And I still wake up early. And my bare feet still touch the cold kitchen floor. And I still make breakfast for my family. And I still brew the coffee. But now when I do these things I am not doing them because I am afraid of what happens if I do not. And I am doing them because this is my home and I have chosen to be here and I have built something real inside these walls. And there is a difference between a woman who serves because she has to and a woman who gives because she chooses to. And the first one slowly disappears. And the second one grows. And I choose to grow. And every morning when I look in the mirror I say one thing to myself before I start the day. And I say, Sarah, you are still here. And then I go make the coffee. And I mean it as a gift to the people I love. And not as a punishment for being born a woman.